For those of you just joining, the slides that Jamie is going to present from are the trauma and the 12 steps that are at the top of the frame there. You can click on that and download them. The ones from Dr. Stan Tatkin are the interdependence in the recovery world. So you can, if you miss those, you can catch those. And then Eddie Caparucci's are the how the inner child impacts addiction. So they're not in order of presentations, but they're all there, and that's what really matters. So. What state are you physically in right now?
I'm in Pennsylvania right now.
Okay.
But I'm from Ohio. Yep.
I'm in Arizona, so
Okay.
it's nice and toasty here.
Yes, I'd imagine it usually is whenever I have visited Arizona.
For those of you joining us, we're glad you're here. We're going to start in about 8 minutes. You'll be able to do the IM to ask questions. Just IM me, and Jamie's going to present on the trauma and the 12 steps that's at the top of your screen. You can download the presentation if you'd like to have that and follow along, or save it for later. And she's got links to information in that presentation too, including her, I think your website's on there too, right?
Yep.
Yeah, traumamadesimple.com is on there, and her new book. So all of that. So she'll be presenting for about 40 minutes or so, and then you'll have about 20 minutes to have your questions answered before the next 12-step meeting. And then after that one, Eddie Caparucci will be joining us for the final session today, talking about going deeper and inner child. So. And we will be publishing the July, I can't believe it, July Super Saturday Recovery Summit presenters. I'm hoping to get the August ones out too, because we've got lineups for both July and August. So we'll get that information out to you on the In the Room's landing page, hopefully, or homepage, so that you can save the date. But just plan on joining us on the third Saturday of every month, and it'll just be who's going to be here to share their insights with you. So we were talking about your book. I assume it's on pre-order on Amazon?
Yep. Pre-order Amazon, literally everywhere books are sold, because
cool.
Penguin's distributing it, so it's more places than I've ever seen one of my books available.
Well, there you go.
Which
and it
is
will
pretty
be the
exciting.
featured book for July on In the Room, so you
I'm
can learn
so
more.
excited about that. Yep.
Yeah, that is great. So since we've got a couple minutes, and you've been on the In the Rooms platform for a long
Hmm.
time, I want to honor both RT and Kenny who created the
Yes.
In the Rooms platform. I mean, that's a vision to
Yep.
create a platform. We're all using it a lot more right now,
Hmm.
but to have the forethought to think of a platform where you can bring people together from literally all over the world, and continue to grow your recovery, learn new things, connect. It's great. So we
Yep.
at Seeking Integrity really appreciate it. So how this particular event came about is Dr. Rob Weiss, who's been doing the In the Rooms
Hmm.
meeting on Friday night for sex, love, and addiction for like 4 years. He said, I think Jamie and I started about the same time,
Hmm.
on the platform, and so and he's continued to do that. And he had this idea to bring presentations
Hmm.
different than just meetings, but have these
Yeah.
presentations available, to anyone. So graciously, the In the Rooms guys said, let's make it happen. So here we are. This is our third one.
Great. That's wonderful. And I just want to shout out from my perspective that RT and Kenny and Rob, they are three of my favorite people, just as people, but also in the visionary department as well. In the new book, In Trauma and the 12 Steps, I do shout out Kenny and RT for being part of this movement of vision towards how we really do need to innovate to reach people in recovery. And yeah, isn't it interesting? As you said, now we're all online doing
Yes.
meetings, and they were, I mean, I know I often make the joke, they were doing it before it was cool, or
Yeah.
before we all
Yeah.
really needed it.
Before we
And
had to. Yes. Yeah.
yes, and I just applaud them for that. And I have referred folks to In the Rooms for years as a professional, particularly people who can't access meetings readily because of where they live geographically, or in an area like mine where you can't get a lot of the specialty fellowships
Right.
or meetings that might be a little harder to find in the area. So I just think the In the Rooms platform has saved a lot of lives and is making a huge difference.
Well, and I agree. And, I've had, moms with small kids that are going like, I just need a meeting. Go to In the
Hmm.
Rooms, I
Hmm.
mean, there's,
You'll find something. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Or people that are, health issues or for whatever reasons, had a harder time getting out. Or like you
Hmm.
said, remote areas where there just
Hmm.
aren't as many, or, I mean, I was fortunate to have a place when I first got into recovery. There was a club I could go like really
Hmm.
any time of the day or night, and have a safe place to go. But if I had been in some remote place and I had one meeting a week, I wouldn't have made it. I just wouldn't have made it. I
Hmm.
needed a lot more. So,
Right.
oh, good. I just found this one before this, and going to be ongoing Saturday summit. Have two in a row. That's great.
Lovely.
Yeah. And it's different information. I mean, you know, um, I think it's just really good to look at going to a meeting. I'm there. I'm working on my recovery, da da da. But to have somebody go, let's talk about this topic,
Hmm.
and then have the ability to think about how does that apply to my life, my recovery, my relationships. All of that is really valuable, I think.
Yes.
So for those of you joining us, great, glad you're here. We're going to start in a couple of minutes. Jamie Marich is going to talk about trauma and the 12 steps. She started the meeting on Wednesday night, we think at 8:30 p.m. Eastern time,
Yeah.
that
Hmm.
continues for trauma and recovery. So if this topic resonates, I invite you to join that meeting. It has continued without Jamie's personal involvement, lately, but she was the one that originated it. So this is a presentation for the next 40 minutes or so. You can ask questions by IMing them to me, and I will ask them after the presentation is over. It can be on the information that she's sharing, or if something comes up, as you're listening, great. We welcome those. This will be recorded, so I'm going to ask you not to request to share, because I'm just going to X you out of those, because we want to keep this anonymous so that we can uh, have it on YouTube without having people breaking their anonymity. So I think it's time. So I'm going to do a really brief intro, picking through some of the things, but I would love to have you take a moment and tell a little bit more about yourself too. So beyond being a licensed professional counselor, um, oh, I wanted to make sure, because Rob was hoping to come back and be able to introduce you. So I was like hoping it was him, but it isn't. So, but he was trying. So EMDR certified, and I'd love to have you talk a little bit about what that is,
Mm-hmm.
because that's just, there's so many letters in the therapy world, but
Mm-hmm.
I personally benefit from EMDR. So if you talk a little bit
Sure.
about that, but what she's really here to talk about, she's got lots of credentials. If you haven't downloaded the Trauma and the 12 Steps, please do so. But she's got, she looks at trauma. She's got, her website is called, I just saw it, trauma design, no, trauma, say it again.
Trauma Made
Trauma
Simple
Made
is,
Simple. Thank
mhm,
you.
is the
It all
easiest
meshed together.
website to find my stuff. Yep.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes. So her new book is coming out in July, and it will be a featured book on In the Room. So watch for information about that. And without further ado, I'm going to let you start. So again, download those Trauma and the 12 Steps if you'd like to follow along.
Great. So, hi, everybody. My name is Jamie Marich. Professionally, I'm Dr. Jamie Marich, but from a recovery standpoint, I'm just Jamie M. I am a woman in long-term recovery. I'm a recovering alcoholic, addict, codependent, etc., as I like to say, because I qualify for about 13 different fellowships at least. And there's a common thread through all of them, which is this tendency I have to need to kill pain that can be very deeply ingrained in my body, that really started as a result of a lot of unhealed trauma that I needed to address when I first came into recovery. So my personal story and my professional story are pretty intertwined. So I know Tammy let you in on a couple of my credentials, and that I do have a PhD, and I'm an author, and I'm a trainer. I'm an EMDR therapist and an EMDR trainer, and I'll speak as was asked a little bit more about that. But since the title of this presentation today is Trauma and the 12 Steps, I think I'll give you a little bit of a background about how this project came about, because this project really came about as a reflection of how I have viewed my life and recovery since having the privilege of getting sober in 2002. So if I continue to do what I'm supposed to do, coming up here on July 8th, I'll have 18 years of continuous sobriety. And I make no apologies, or I should say, I fully credit the fact that I am still here and still alive and I'm still sober today, because I had the person who brought me 12-step recovery as a sponsor, because she was very trauma informed.
So I'm getting multiple messages that they can't hear you. I can hear you perfectly, so I'm not quite sure what's going on. Kenny, any ideas? I could hear, but not the speaker. So I don't want to. I'm going to try
Oh,
publishing.
I undid toggle audio. I don't know if that made a difference.
I hear you. Can everybody hear her now? She's not. Yes, it made a difference. Okay.
It made a difference. That was it. I'll
Okay.
start over again then.
Please.
So hi, everybody. My name is Jamie Marich. I am the author of the upcoming revised and expanded edition of Trauma and the 12 Steps. And as Tammy mentioned, professionally, I have a lot of credentials. I'm an EMDR therapist. I'm an EMDR trainer. And I'll talk a little bit more later about what that means. I'm an author of many books in trauma. Yet from a personal perspective, I am just another person in recovery. And that's probably the most important identifier I have today. So I identify as an alcoholic, addict, codependent, etc. in long-term recovery. I qualify for about 13 different fellowships at least. And the common thread is this tendency that I can have, if unhealed, to need to go to these things outside of myself in order to feel relief. And the one thing I have consistently found through every season of my growth and recovery is that when trauma and wounds I experience remain unhealed, it makes me more vulnerable to using these things outside of myself in order to exist in the world. So if I continue to do what I need to do, on July 8th, I'll have 18 years of continuous sobriety from drugs and alcohol. I'm still working, though, on a lot of other behavioral addictions too. Food, love, relationships, codependency have been things I've continued to struggle with. When I first came into recovery, I used to sit in meetings and hear people say things like, I got married and divorced in recovery. And I used to feel really bad because that sounded very sad. And I have now been married and divorced twice in recovery. So one of my really dear friends always used to say, I think the relationship part of our lives can be one of the last things to get better, because for many of us, it was the first thing to get hurt. And that was very much my story when it comes to trauma. So I want to thank Tammy for making this platform available. Since there was some problems with my audio, I think before the meeting, not everybody may have heard my shout out to Kenny and RT and Rob, and just thanking them for making this platform available. I am big fans of In the Rooms. As Tammy mentioned, I offered a meeting on here for quite some time that's still going on, and I still regularly participate in some other meetings as I'm invited to. And I just adore what this platform does in terms of making recovery more accessible for people. And that is, in fact, a big theme of what I have always covered in my writing, especially trauma and the 12 steps. So my professional and my personal story are pretty intricately woven. So I do have slides that you can go ahead and reference. I went ahead and brought them up, so hopefully you can take a peek at them as we go. Although my hope here is, for these 40 minutes I have, is to just talk to you a little bit about what Trauma in the 12 Steps means as a project, and how it's continuing to evolve as a project through my writing and through resources that I make available. So when the first edition of Trauma in the 12 Steps came out in 2000, it was 2012 was the first edition. And so if you take a look here on the slides, the left is the first edition and the right is this new released, revised and expanded edition that is coming out on July 7th. So when I was doing interviews for the first edition, somebody asked me what my hope was in writing this book. And I didn't really think too much about it until I was put on the spot and asked that question. And what came out of my mouth at that point is, my hope for this book is that everybody who comes into recovery would have the opportunity to be met with the kind of sponsorship that I was met with when I first came in. I was brought recovery by a lovely woman named Janet Leff, who's no longer with us. She passed away in 2017, and she understood trauma. We use this word now, trauma informed, quite a bit in the professional field, and I'll explain. Basically means you understand trauma and the way that unhealed trauma can impact people's behavior, and the way that that behavior can get in the way of the recovery process. And Janet understood that, and she knew not to push me when I first came in. She was the very embodiment of attraction rather than promotion. And I really, truly believe that the only reason I am here today is because she was the one who worked her 12th step essentially and brought me recovery. And yeah, it broke my heart when I kind of got into more recovery meetings after my initial relationship with her, where we were living. And I saw that there were a lot of people who were not very trauma informed. And I saw a lot of problems in meetings, and a lot of problems in treatment centers, and a lot of ignorance to the reality of trauma. So yeah, I wrote Trauma in the 12 Steps because it is my hope that both counselors and sponsors, because that was my initial audience for writing the book, that anybody who was in a position to help others be guided in a recovery program would more effectively understand how unhealed trauma could get in the way of people attaining and maintaining recovery. Because Janet understood that. A lot of people I've met through the years have understood that, but a lot of people don't. And I believe that there still is a lot of power and potential in 12-step recovery to reach people. Because one thing I can say from my perspective as somebody who's now also a mental health clinician and works in more of the trauma field is a lot of my colleagues in that field don't think much of the 12 steps anymore, because there's a lot of criticism that the 12 steps are outdated and not trauma informed enough, and anything scathing you may have written or read criticizing the 12 steps in mainstream media. I've heard all those criticisms, and to be honest, I even have some criticisms myself, not necessarily of the steps, but the way that I see people in treatment centers tending to apply the steps. And I think that is a big part of what I want to take on in this book. So yeah, if I can step you back a little bit to how I first got sober and what Janet did that was really effective in helping me to not only get sober, but really embrace this challenge to heal my wounds. So I had no intention of ever being a clinical professional, a counselor, a psychologist, a professor, a writer, anything that I am now. I actually began as an English teacher and a performing artist, and I took one psychology class in undergrad, and I thought it was horrific. And I ended up going to, I finished my undergraduate degree in English and American Studies with a history component to it. So basically means I have a pop culture degree. I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. And the thing I worked on most steadily when I was in college was the progression of my alcoholism. Because when I got out of my parents' house, which was a very repressed, religiously toxic environment. I was also bullied pretty significantly in school because I was very much the misfit and had been overweight most of my life. So through a great majority of my childhood, I didn't feel safe very many places. I do feel it's important to highlight religious trauma as a valid form of trauma. Religious trauma, spiritual abuse is something we're talking about quite a bit now. And when I was younger, my father got involved with just a very, let's just say a very intense religious group who's, who didn't think twice about being horrible to people as a way to get their point across. And as a very sensitive, innately very spiritual person, that is a lot of what caused so much of my wounding growing up. And I think a lot of you listening on this call or who are in recovery and maybe listening later have likely been told you're so sensitive. I'm the poster child for that. When I was 5, I cried when they painted Big Bird blue in a Sesame Street special. And I think my parents looked at me like, what is this child we have? Because she just cries so much and feels things so strongly. And in recovery, I've learned how to use that feeling strongly to my advantage. But until I learned tools to really navigate it all, it just made food and chemicals and acting out in various ways very appealing. So when I finished my undergraduate degree, I had started a graduate program that I didn't want to be in. I was in a very toxic relationship that that's a whole other talk. I think a lot of you get it. And I knew something had to be done. After Thanksgiving of 2000, just having a horrible drinking experience that weekend, I woke up kind of with what a lot of us know is that still small voice inside saying, you got to do something, because if you don't do something, you're going to be dead by Christmas. So at the time, all I really knew how to do was move to Europe. So it was a total geographic cure at the moment, I admit it. Because I did try to seek help from both of my parents that fall when things were getting bad. And I mean, I really believe they only were able to meet me with what they had. And my dad's answer was, go back to church. You know, you're a fallen away sinner. And my mom's answer was, well, you're too smart to do drugs. Can't you just drink? And so I really took that as kind of endorsement from my mom, but I was still struggling very strongly. And I do feel it's important to talk about cross addiction because a lot of, I struggled with that. Well, what am I really? And I take this on in the book as I don't think there's any room in the modern era for fellowships or treatment centers to split hairs about, well, we only work with this kind of addicted or alcoholic person here, because there's so few pure alcoholics anymore. And there's that point. And the other point is, like, when I think of my story, I became a bigger alcoholic in the long run because I didn't understand the relationship between drugs and alcohol and that it was all going to kill me. So I knew initially that I had an issue using drugs, but I was so grateful again that my sponsor, Janet, helped me to understand the interplay between the two. So the reason I moved to Europe, I know I left you all kind of hanging with that. My family is from a country originally called Croatia, which is one of the countries in the former Yugoslavia. And there was a horrible civil war there in the early 90s. And in 2000, when I moved there, there were still a lot of aid efforts in place. I spoke enough Croatian. I had an English degree, so I was able to teach English. I worked for a Catholic parish primarily, doing English instruction at a home for displaced children and some humanitarian aid work. And then after I had lived in country for about 8 months, Janet, the sponsor that I mentioned, moved into town. And she was, how shall I say, she was just a really good person. And I already mentioned she was the epitome of attraction rather than promotion. And I just liked her. And my first exposure to any recovery meeting of any kind was to go and translate for her. So I was not a professional translator, but I was good in a pinch. And she went to what was essentially a county council on alcoholism. So it wasn't a 12-step meeting, but I was able to go and translate for her, and everything that people were talking about was making sense to me. And so I was able to ask her a lot of questions, and she gave me my first big book in Croatian, saying, here, why don't you read this? It might help you learn some of the words. She knew, but she also knew she had to tread very gently. So about a month later, I got into a pinch again with a bad relationship, and I had used drugs when I hadn't for a long time, but I had been drinking, and we know how that works. And I knew she was somebody I could talk to, that she just made that kind of an impression with me. So on that first day, I met with her, and I gave her a lot of what I call my life and chemicals. And she just knew. And she said to me after that, Jamie, the good news here is that you're alcoholic. And I asked her how that was good news. And she said, it's good news because we know what to do about it. And also in the coming months the months that followed, she was also able to identify so much of my experience as the result of unhealed trauma. When I was working one day, I had a meltdown. That's the only way I could describe it. It was a complete implosive meltdown based on a disagreement I got into with my boss, who was this really kind of wonderful Croatian priest. And I had melted down so badly, he did not know what to do. So he called Janet, and she told him, Father, this isn't just a girl acting out. This is trauma. Let me take care of it. And we went back to where I was staying, and she kind of nursed me through the crying jag episode and started asking me a lot of questions about trauma. And at that point, like many, I had only thought trauma was associated with this post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, and I thought you had to go to Vietnam to get it. And she really helped me to understand that the definition of a war zone is so broad, that you may have experienced war in your house, in your neighborhood. And again, she just validated so much of my experience. And what she said on that day, is the piece of advice that has defined my recovery. It's defined my career. It's defined my mission for this book and my work. And she said, Jamie, after everything you went through, it's no wonder you turned out alcoholic. What are you going to do about it now? And what that really ended up meaning for me is she validated me first, and then she challenged me. Because too often in recovery circles, I think we can get into challenging people, this kind of tough love mentality. We don't want to give people excuses, stay in today and all of this. That wouldn't have worked for me. I needed to know that somebody was there and cared and listened and kind of understood what I was going through. And then once I had that sense of safety and assurance, then I was open to being challenged. But something I really emphasize is we have to do it if we're working with people in that order. validate, and then challenge. And yeah, in the circles that I run in, I tend to see problems on both extremes, right? I see some people who are in recovery circles getting a little too rigid with, challenge, 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 do this, do that, do this, stay out of your head. What happened in the past doesn't matter. And then on the trauma end of things, I can see a lot of my colleagues there almost getting too caught up in the compassion and the validation. Like, you're doing these things because of the trauma, and that's why, but they don't really give a lot in the way of actionable solution. So what I've always taught is this both and approach, that we have to validate, we have to challenge. If we're being rigid in any one format, that's where we end up alienating people. So yeah, after everything you've went through, it's no wonder you turned out this way. What are you going to do about it? And I'm just so grateful that she was there to accept me and to challenge me. So yes, the original Trauma 12 came out in 2012, and this new edition is now out 8 years later, represents 8 more years of some research and insight, and 2 more chapters. And the 2 new chapters that I cover are the importance of working with diversity as a trauma-informed issue, making sure that our spaces are welcome for everybody. Because again, I have heard so many horror stories throughout the years of LGBTQ folks, of folks who are not white and Christian, being treated horribly in certain meetings and certain treatment centers. And I really make a call that we have to be inclusive of everybody if we're truly going to be ambassadors of recovery, especially in a trauma-informed way. And I also do a new chapter on what I call spiritual diversity, which is really challenging us to look at, are we treating atheists and agnostics respectfully in recovery spaces? And in the new chapter, I do interview my sponsor's husband, who is a card-carrying atheist and still over 30 years sober in a 12-step program. And I ask him, how has he done it? And something that he shared in his experience that really impressed me was his first sponsor, as he said, could have cared less. Whether I believed in God, whether I even worked with higher power, he was just glad I was there. And that to me also represents this real heart and mission of being able to meet people compassionately where they are. So this next slide about rigidity, I want to address, because there's another story from my formation that I once more really gives some insight into why I wanted to write a book on all of this in the first place. So after eventually getting and staying sober, working in Europe, I came back to the US in 2003, and I entered a graduate counseling program. Janet and the priest both thought I'd be good at it. And so they sent me back, and I was kicking and screaming saying, but I don't even like psychology. And a couple really interesting things happened very early in my career. One was that when I was doing graduate internship in 2004, I was about 2 years sober completely at that point. And I found myself getting very triggered by many of the students and teenagers that I was asked to work with. And when I looked at it, it wasn't the kids that were triggering me so much as it was the way I saw the system treating the kids. Psychiatrists, Children Protective Services, the courts in our area. And it just brought up a lot of unhealed stuff in me. And I had a coworker at the facility who called me out on it. He goes, Jamie, you often look like you're here, but not here. This phenomena that I come to understand is dissociation, which very much defined my childhood, like being able to escape in my head. And once I found chemicals, it really amplified that process. And I was beating myself up a little bit because I knew a lot of the fundamentals of 12-step. I knew which slogans I should be using, how I should be confronting my thinking errors, but I was still stuck. And I don't know if any of you relate to that experience of being sober, but still wanting to die because mental health symptoms were really unchecked. So at that point is when I was referred to EMDR therapy that I mentioned that I now teach and train in. And EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It sounds a little weird on the surface because it was discovered by a psychologist who realized that if you move your eyes back and forth while you're following a light or following fingers, if you move your body back and forth, if you're being tapped, or if you move, or if you wear earphones like I'm wearing now, and you hear the sound going back and forth, that this alternating or bilateral motion can really help your brain reorganize how information is stored. That's the easiest way I can explain it in summary. And what it essentially does is it gets to this part of our brain that exists below words, because the impact of unhealed trauma is really in the body. And you may have good rational sense of what has happened. You may have good tools like what 12-step recovery can offer. But at a certain point, if you don't really heal the deeper stuff, you may get stuck. And that's exactly what happened with me at 2 years sober. I was getting very stuck. And I needed this more innovative trauma-focused treatment in order to really move through. So then I started working in the addiction treatment field. End of 2004, 2005, I started working, interning, and then working in some rehab centers. And I was working at this pretty well-known treatment center in my area. And I was mystified why they weren't talking about trauma, or why we weren't working on trauma. And a lot of that mystification or being mystified came from my own experience, that I had a very trauma-informed first sponsor. And I knew just how much trauma therapy helped me get through this big episode in earlier recovery. And I went to my superior, my clinical director at this treatment center, and I asked him, it seems like the same people are coming back over and over and over again. And they're people with really hard lives and have issues to deal with. Why aren't we doing anything to help them deal with those issues? And he said, that's not our job here. It's not our job to work with trauma. And it was very much what I've come to learn as real old school type of mentality, that until people realize they're addicts and they need the steps, you're just complicating matters looking at trauma. And if you look at trauma, you're giving people excuses, and we have to keep it simple here. And I think a lot of you know this mentality. And I tried pleading with him from my own experience. And at one point, I was even getting a little activated saying, are you telling me I first used opiates at 12 because life was good? And he said, no, you used opiates at 12 because you're an addict. And it was just all came back to a lot of that real kind of rigid thinking. And really, quite frankly, now that I'm a professional and know better, antiquated thinking. So something I talk about in the book and throughout my trainings is that rigid acceptance of the disease model, or even any alternative model, because I see people who are still very faith-based model, who can be very rigid about this is what people need to do to get sober. On the trauma end of things, I can see people get very rigid about, people need trauma therapy and they're not going to get sober. And the key is any rigidity is typically not trauma sensitive. It's not individualized. And I've really grown up in the field from this perspective of we have to look at all of it. Because yes, we need trauma care as part of addiction care, but also looking at the impact of addiction has to be part of that too. And I still think the 12 steps are really well suited in giving people like a plan of daily action that they can take. So if you are finding yourself in rigidity, if you're finding yourself in, well, this is what worked for me, so it's going to work for you, that's not trauma sensitive. And that's a real challenge that I make in the book. So what does trauma even mean? I think we need to, a half hour into my talk where I've been talking about trauma so much. And I think a lot of you have a sense of what trauma means from your lived experience, but I really do want to unpack it a little bit more here. Trauma means wound. It is a pretty simple, direct translation. The English word trauma comes from the Greek word meaning wound. So if you're struggling to understand what trauma is and maybe how it's affected you, I would ask you to think maybe the word trauma is a little big and just think of wounds. Where have you been wounded in your life? And even as a professional today, when I'm asked for my working definition of trauma, it's just really any unhealed wound. And those wounds can be physical, mental, emotional, sexual, financial, spiritual, as I talked about. And a real template for better understanding this is to think about physical wounds and how they heal. So a couple things that may be coming to you right away is that wounds often need to be treated from the outside in. We may need to wash them out, stitch them, bandage them. And that initial care can be an important part of the stabilization, but wounds really need to heal from the inside out. And the parallel I make there is that so much of what the 12 steps can offer and what treatment centers can offer and initial care really is that stabilization. But we may need other measures, or what the program has long called outside help, to really do a lot of that inside out healing. And something that I do call out in the book is that if you have a sponsor or somebody in a recovery fellowship who's telling you, you don't need to take those meds, or you don't need counseling, you just need to not drink and go to meetings, that is bad information, that is irresponsible. And it really goes against the core of what Bill Wilson himself even taught, which is that outside help may be required. And what we're dealing with nowadays, what we've learned about the true progression of addiction and the role that unhealed trauma plays in that, outside help likely will be required. And it's not putting down meetings or putting down the fellowship, but it's also approaching this from a very both and type of perspective. So wounds can come in all different shapes and sizes. Some wounds may require immediate medical treatment, and other wounds, treatment may require that you wash it out, you put a Band-Aid on it, you give it some time and space to heal. But if even that rather innocuous wound doesn't get treated, it can go on to fester and infect and cause complications. The health of a person can determine if a wound heals clean or not. If somebody is immunocompromised, which is a word we know well now with COVID, it could take the healing process a lot longer. So I say that to speak to this idea that wounds can be very individualized in how they manifest and in how they go on to heal. And in a lot of cases with physical wounding, professional treatment will be required. But even when professional treatment's not required, we still have to pay attention to the fact that something is there. And I could talk about this metaphor forever, and indeed I have. I have a TEDx talk on it that I'll tell you where you can get. But one other part of this metaphor is that if we don't heal our wounds, they can continue to bleed and fester, like I mentioned. And this is more than just physical wounds. I hope now that you're seeing that there's a parallel here, right? Between physical wounding and emotional wounding and all the other kinds of wounding. And if we don't heal our wounds, we end up bleeding all over everybody else. I think a lot of you have heard that slogan, hurt people hurt people. And this is essentially what happens when we blow our stuff onto everyone else. And this is, to me, very interesting because COVID has gotten us, I think, a lot more aware of what it means to contaminate and to infect. I mean, we're wearing masks now primarily to protect others. And the physical healthcare industry has gotten more savvy to this idea that if we don't protect against transmission, if we're not clean in how we handle things in facilities, people can get sicker. Contamination can happen. Why haven't we done the same thing in the addiction treatment field? Because unhealed trauma can cause the same type of contamination at an emotional level. So, to further explain why, and my website that I mentioned, traumamadesimple.com, is where you can get my TEDx talk that I did in 2015, and I unpack and explore this trauma as wound metaphor a lot more there. So something that I like to say when I make commentary about traditional treatment and the 12 steps, it's not necessarily bad what we do, but it's not enough. It's very outside in type of healing. If we're using the wound metaphor, it's very what we do by talking, connecting with others, giving people knowledge about their disease or their disorder, knowledge about the addiction and its progression. It's good, but it's very outside in. It's very much working from the top of the brain down, which, once more using the wound metaphor, can be useful when it comes to stabilization. So if you don't have familiarity with what is called the triune brain model, I want to walk you through this just real quickly, and then this will kind of wrap up the educational part of it. Because you may be on the other end of this saying, yeah, this is all well and good with trauma, but what do we do about it? Or other people have gotten well without necessarily doing trauma counseling. Let me explain a little bit of what's going on in the brain. So if everybody would go ahead and make a fist. If you have capacity to make a fist, make a fist. And there's a lot more that can be studied on the brain and trauma and addiction, but what I'm going to give you in the next few minutes here is a true overview. So the human brain is really 3 different brains working together as one. And I have this explained a lot more in the book, and this is actually a graphic that we use in the book. And this hand model of the brain comes from the work of Dan Siegel, and it's a very good explanatory model. So the 3 brains of the human brain are the neocortex, which is the outside in, the limbic brain, and the brainstem. But you really have to think of it as being from the inside out. So the brainstem is the oldest brain in that it's the brain that we tend to have in common with lizards, with reptiles. It's the brain that is equated with animal life. So anything that you might have in common with a lizard or a reptile, that is governed by this brainstem. And the brainstem is responsible for sensation, these body level experiences, the freeze potential. The limbic brain is the center of the brain, which governs functions like emotion, learning. It filters information that comes through. It alerts us to danger. This limbic brain is also called the mammalian brain because all mammals have this in common. And then we have the neocortex, which is the top of the brain down, speech, logic, higher level thinking skills. And in a healthy human brain, we really need all 3 of these brains working together to be as healthy and as integrative as possible. But unhealed trauma can remain stuck in the limbic brain, or could remain stuck in this limbic activation, the center of the brain, if it doesn't have a chance to be healed or to be processed. So one of the key things to understand is when the limbic system gets overactivated, when it gets triggered, which is a word we hear a lot in both relapse context and trauma context, when something is unresolved that gets triggered in the limbic brain, what essentially happens is that the neocortex shuts down. It goes offline. So all of those functions of the neocortex, like speech, logic, and higher level thinking skills, are not really there anymore. A way to think of it, if we're really keeping it real, is to ask if you've ever tried to talk reason to someone who's in crisis. And you can admit if you've tried. I've tried to talk reason to someone who's in crisis. And why it doesn't really work is that trying to talk reason to someone who is in crisis is like trying to send an email without internet signal. You may have wonderful things to say, but if that left prefrontal part of the brain isn't online, because blood flow suspends when the limbic system gets activated. You may have heard that phrase before, his blood is up. Really what that means is all the blood has gone to the limbic brain to keep the brain safe, to keep the whole system safe, and we can't access reason. Another example I can give you is, have you ever asked someone who relapsed, what were you thinking? We weren't thinking. The whole I should know better part of the brain, or the wisdom to know the difference that we pray in the Serenity Prayer, that's the neocortex. And we may have complete inability to access it when we're activated by unhealed trauma. So maybe think about it. When somebody is in crisis, if you're a sponsor or if you're a counselor, what has worked? And it's probably things like just sitting and listening while they vent, maybe taking a walk around the building, doing some breath, doing some jumping jacks, getting physical. And so all of those more action-oriented, relationally oriented interventions tend to work to at least help the crisis pass. And then once a crisis has passed, a person is typically more receptive to maybe hearing you talk reason or hearing you share experience, strength, and hope. And the key is, hopefully over time, an individual who still struggles with trauma and relapse triggers will be able to access treatment or help, so that we could actually heal what is still stuck in the limbic system. And so we don't go on to being as susceptible to being triggered. But to also know that if we are triggered, we may have to go into more of these action-oriented, feeling-oriented interventions to at least stabilize ourselves again and be open to what a lot more of the reason-based interventions and the steps have taught us. So we need all of it, is really what I'm arguing here in my work and in this book. And I know I'm nearing towards the end of my time, so I have a few more slides that I didn't quite get to. I never know how these things are going to go when I do
keep
talks.
going.
Yeah.
So, and let me just quick say, I know a couple people have mentioned that they're having some trouble with the sound. Hopefully most of you are hearing this. It will be recorded. But if you've got questions for Jamie, IM them to me, and I will ask Jamie those as soon as she's done. But keep you're on a roll. Keep going.
Yeah. So I want to try to make this a little more practical, a little more actionable. Because if you do have a little more time to look through the slides later to understand the brain and to check out some of the resources, then hopefully you can dive in a little bit more there. Trauma informed. I'd like to explain just a little bit about what is meant by trauma informed versus trauma focused. So trauma informed care, as I already mentioned, is essentially having an understanding of trauma and how it impacts the person, how it impacts the system, and we bring our care in alignment with that. So through some of my other work, I've made this graph, and I do explore it again in the new book, because there is a subtle difference between being trauma informed and being trauma focused. And trauma focused is perhaps more the realm of people who work in professional treatment, because we may have the skills and hopefully can at least hook people up with the skills that they may need to really do the deepest dive with some of their trauma healing that needs done. But all of us can be trauma informed, whether you're a sponsor, whether you're someone who, I'm thinking of somebody that I interviewed as part of my own dissertation research a decade ago. And she said, everybody at this treatment center made me believe that I can get sober. And she said, everybody, from the doctors and nurses to the cooks to the janitors to the people who did intake. And it was just this institutional belief that you can do it. Yeah, you've been in treatment 25 times, but this could be the time you actually do it. And she compared that to other treatment centers she had been to, where doctors and other professionals rolled their eyes at her and said, oh, it's you again. How's it going to be different this time? And take the cotton out of your ears and put it into your mouth. And just a lot of these very shaming things. So being trauma informed is for all of us. I often tell professionals that I train, your secretary, your support staff, the person answering your phone is one of the most important people in your system, because they're the ones who set that first experience for people. And there's so much about being treated with dignity and having a relational connection that is actually very healing at that level of the limbic brain. So if you're trauma informed, you recognize the role that unhealed trauma plays in human behavior. You recognize that if trauma remains unhealed, it can shut off a person's ability to really access reason, to access wisdom. And that a lot of our interventions that are tailored around getting people to, check their thinking might not be very effective. Another thing I have done in the Trauma 12 Steps work is I call out a lot of our slogans we use in 12-step recovery that are not very effective, like think, 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 or think the drink through. Because the reality is that when your survival brain is activated, you can't think. So what else are we giving people besides just some of these kind of trite slogans is something that I kind of lovingly challenge. Being trauma informed provides a template for minimizing harm in the delivery of human services. So how do we do no harm? How do we make sure that a person doesn't feel like this is going to be one more place, this meeting or this treatment center, where I'm going to be invalidated for who I am. A lot of you, especially if you've had some Al-Anon or adult child work, may know this phrase, don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. That the 3 unwritten rules of the alcoholic home, right, are don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. All 3 of those completely go against what a person may need to heal trauma, which is to talk, to vent, to be validated, to have a loving person who can witness it for you, and to be given a space to feel it through. And when we're not given that in our childhood spaces, that's where things can continue to fester and infect. And so how would it feel if somebody came to a meeting, for instance, and was told something like, take the cotton out of your ears and put it into your mouth? Because yeah, I get the intention of that slogan, which is listen. Yet, is there a kinder way we can say that still makes a person feel like, hey, what I do have to say matters. I am validated. I am welcome. And then being trauma informed offers an educational framework for human services systems. So for example, in the book, I already mentioned here how I take on some of the slogans. A lot of them are good. A lot of them are not very trauma informed. And I really want people to see that the slogans aren't essential, really. They're just kind of folk sayings that have developed. Another way we can be more trauma informed with some folks is looking at struggles that people may have in certain language in the steps. So I take on, for instance, how the word powerless and the phrase character defects are often sticking points for people that are in a recovery program, because the unhealed trauma has really just made those words pretty abrasive. And the key is, what I like to do with my clients is help me understand why this word is a challenge for you. And let's unpack it. Maybe we need to find another word. Maybe we need to, so for instance, with me, something I really had to understand is that when I say I am powerless over alcohol, it's not admitting that I'm a powerless person. It's admitting that if I put the alcohol in my body, the alcohol will win. And once I was able to really see it that way, I actually tapped into a lot of my own power. So the language and the steps can have some problems to a lot of people. And to me, part of being trauma informed is not being so, but this is the way the steps worked, and it worked for me, it'll work for you. Unpack it with folks. And by doing that, they generally will still be able to find the gold that's within these steps. And something else I think we really have to understand, if we as sponsors, as people in recovery helping others, or even as professionals want to be trauma informed, is to recognize that the steps were really only meant to be suggestive only. And what's hilarious to me, especially when people criticize 12 steps, is that's one of the most trauma informed things I can think of. Is it's an invitation, it's a suggestion. This whole phrase we use of experience, strength, and hope, I think is wonderful, because what you're saying with people is, this is what I have to offer, or take what you like and leave the rest. All of those are very trauma informed. You're not asserting your rigidity on people. And if you are, either as a sponsor or as a professional, and people aren't responding well to it, you do have to look at, is this more about my own unhealed wounds than it is about the person themselves? So we'll open it up here for questions in a bit. Just want to let you know that in the book, I do cite some research which really shows that these 4 skills, mindful breathing, body scanning and body awareness, being mindful of how cravings feel in our body, and then doing informal mindfulness. So this can be things like yoga, dance, taking daily activities and turning them into an opportunity to practice meditation. These are all vital in helping to build that connection between the limbic brain and the neocortex, and allowing us to build more actionable skills for recovery. Janet, who I really shouted out at the beginning of this presentation, she always used to say, chapter 6 of the big book is called Into Action, not Into Thinking. And she really emphasized that importance of action. And so I give a lot of skills in the book that look at things we can do. I shout out another early influence on me. She was part of my support system, passed away many years ago, named Jan Canal. And she always said when she was in recovery, she learned about mindfulness Bye. She said, when I went to go and do the laundry, I just did the laundry. I didn't have anything else going at a million times. If I was going to wash the dishes, I would just wash the dishes. And I tell clients now, if you're going to brush your teeth, just brush your teeth. That's how we really build mindfulness and mindful awareness. So once more, traumamadesimple.com is the resource that Tammy shouted out at the beginning. You can get everything I have done for free online there. So videos of a lot of these mindful living coping skills, some trauma-informed yoga sequences are there, articles, other videos and podcasts that I've appeared on. So you can get the link to purchase the new book there if the book does interest you, but know that there's a lot I offer for you and for your clients or sponsees free on that site. So I'd be happy to take some questions right now.
You have a bunch.
Okay, go for it.
You were talking about yoga and things. And so this question is, have you done research on the work of diet to help heal trauma in the body, in addition to treatment? So I thought that was a good question.
Yeah, I've not specifically been involved in that research, but I, know of what exists about it. And yes, I mean, I think it's something treatment centers don't take seriously enough. For instance, how flour and sugar, for instance, are two of the most addictive substances on the planet. I mean, they were my first two drugs of choice. And teaching people how to go more towards water and vegetables in concert with breathing and mindfulness and a lot of these other skills that we emphasized. I mean, what I understand about the state of the literature on that is that really looking at enhanced water intake, enhanced vegetable intake, not only helps with immunity, which a lot of us can use that help in our current society, but I really think does put the brain in the best position to heal.
So Lulu Cooks, I'm going to give a plug for that because she was on last month and
nice.
It was fantastic, and it talked about even reducing cravings and things. So that video will also be posted, as will this one, on In the Room's homepage, hopefully this week. So check those out. Next question is, could Jamie talk about when my betrayed partner is triggered, i.e. stuck in her limbic brain, what specific steps, if any, could I take to help her neocortex get back online?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is to avoid trying to talk reason, avoid trying to make it better, avoid trying to go into solution mode. And I think the key there is, how can you give your partner the space to just kind of vent and feel it out, but also in a way that it helps you feel safe and protected too. Because I know sometimes I've done some work with partners that when the triggered partner acts out or lashes out, you as the partner might feel like you're taking the brunt of that. So I think the key is often, can we go on a walk? Is there something physical we can do, some stretching, some movement together, or do you need me to just sit here and listen? I can speak very personally to that because my partner's also in recovery and is also a trauma survivor. And even when he sees me getting activated when we're having a conversation, he'll say, do we need to just breathe for a while? And fortunately, I'm open and I'm receptive to that. And it always works to just kind of take that pause and not try to talk it through. And I think the key is to talk with your partner when she's not activated about what's the best plan here when you do get activated. Because if you try to come up with a plan when she's in the middle of that activation, it's not going to be as productive as, hey, if this happens, because I understand it might still happen while you're healing, how can I be of best support to you?
I love that.
Yeah.
Don't try to figure it out in the moment. Figure it out when it's not in the moment. But yeah. Okay, this is a longer question. In the First Nations community, we look at our elders, cultures, traditions, and languages for healing, especially with the medicine wheel. This pertains also to spiritual healing, to know where we come from and where we belong and what makes us who we are. Do you advocate this for mixed race people or people who may feel like Western society is in itself traumatizing?
Oh, yes. And I am a huge fan of the Wellbriety movement. If you're not familiar with it, I do shout it out in Trauma and the 12 Steps, because I do think that what Wellbriety has done well is to look at the more indigenous idea that healing can be more circular as opposed to linear. and the steps are often seen through more of a linear lens. And something that I've learned in my work with Native folks over the years and consulting with a lot of people who work with Natives with greater frequency is that really claiming the connection to cultural practices, to spiritual practices, can be vital to the recovery process. Because so much of what unhealed trauma that can lead to addiction is about is disconnection, is this sense of I am cut off from who I truly am, or I've had to just create so much stress for myself trying to fake it, trying to fit in. And I think this can go, and I'm glad you asked the question, because with everything that is happening now, with increased attention being paid to intergenerational trauma and systemic racism and being marginalized, this comes with a high level of stress. And I can think of no greater aggravator of the process of unhealed trauma, or the thing that can stand in the way of recovery most, than trying to hide who you really are. That authenticity and recovery really do go hand in hand. I also want to quote one of my mentors, Melita Johnson, who is just a brilliant Black social worker, just the essence of spirit, and I love her, and she's very much like a mother figure to me. And I had her read my chapters in the book about diversity for some feedback. And something she said that really stuck with me is that oppression can aggravate and complicate the healing process. And it's right there in the book. And so I think whatever methods we can use with our folks to help them reclaim that connection and not be ashamed of who they are will only help the recovery process. And if you haven't used the Wellbriety work or something similar, I think it can exist in concert with 12 steps, or for some people, it may be the better alternative.
Yeah, and I think as you're talking about this, it's like take what you need and leave the rest. So it may be a variety of sources that where you find the pieces of your recovery. So the next question is, I'm a trauma survivor that has been diagnosed with PTSD. A few weeks ago, I started attending the trauma and recovery group on In the Rooms. That's Wednesday night at 8:30 p.m. Eastern time that you started. I have been in therapy for quite a while. I am not sure how to have my therapist help me work through getting emotional flashbacks multiple times in the day. What can I do on my end, and what can my therapist do?
Well, from the therapist perspective, I could just gently suggest you send that website resource that we mentioned, traumamadesimple.com. Because I've really done it to be a one-stop shopping type of place where professionals and folks in recovery alike can just check things out. On that website, there's a really good meditation called Feeling Tone Meditation. It's under videos, Mindfulness of Feeling Tone. That would be a good place to start. Because I do think part of the process here is not about, okay, I'm getting emotionally triggered, I have to shut it off. Rather, I'm getting emotionally triggered. How can I feel this emotion in the safest possible way for me? Because trust me, I know that to feel feelings can feel like the end of the world. It can feel like you're dying. It can feel like the whole room is stopping. But the longer I've done this work, I've become convinced it's not our feelings that causes us problems. It's everything we do to try to keep from feeling our feelings. That's why we drink. That's why we use. That's why we have anxiety attacks, because so many of us have learned that feelings are bad, that feelings will engulf us. And I know what I've had to do in my recovery, and what I encourage others to do, is if you can learn to make friends with your feelings and realize that feeling them is the answer, you're going to get through this. And I know it's easier said than done. And you may have to start with some of the baby steps for feeling. So that's why I think Mindfulness of Feeling Tone could be a good place for you to start, where we really work in small doses. Like, what is something pleasant? How does that feel in the body? What is something that's unpleasant? How does that feel in the body? And then working through, when my body does feel engulfed, what is going to help? And it could be, I mentioned taking the walk around the block. If you have capacity to swim or take a hot or cold shower, maybe the cold water really helps you. Maybe it is something as simple as I need to shake it off of my body. That's why jumping jacks may sound very elementary, but can be very useful. Having a dance party. I know a lot of us know Dance It Out from the Grey's Anatomy reference, but a lot of the expressive arts work I do with people is how do we use expression, dance, drawing, writing, as a way to get this stuff out. Another thing I could recommend that's practical, make yourself a playlist. So whether you're using Spotify, iTunes, even just Google for making playlists, make yourself a playlist and let it be songs that immediately help you feel grounded, happy, safe enough. So that if you are giving yourself the challenge to feel something through and it does end up getting a little bit ahead of you, know that you can put on this playlist and any of those songs will bring you back to a state of balance.
I love that. That's a great practical thing. I'm sorry we're not going to get all the questions answered. Go to traumamadesimple.com. You'll be able to get a lot of tools from Jamie. We're going to have Eddie Caparucci talking about going deeper with inner child work in 1 hour. So come back, join us then. Thank you, Jamie. I want to have lunch when we could really, because
Let's
you're
do
talking
it.
your story and I'm like, oh my
Yeah.
God, we have so much in common. I didn't go to
And
Croatia, so.
And I just want to tell people, if you didn't get your questions answered, I may not get to them immediately, but over the next couple days, I can come back on In the Rooms and you could send them to me on chat.
Yeah, go. Yeah, I am
Yep.
Jamie directly. She'll answer them. I will answer any of those that I can too. So thank you
Great.
so much. All
Oh,
right.
thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.